In 2014, Red Lobster was sold for $2.1 billion. The buyer barely spent any of their own money to do it. Within a few years, the company that had survived for nearly half a century, that put cheap lobster on the table for working families who would never set foot in a fine dining restaurant, was bankrupt. Stores went dark overnight. Employees showed up to find the doors locked. Auctioneers sold off the kitchen equipment. And here's the part that should make you angry. Red Lobster didn't die because people stopped eating there. It didn't die because of one viral all-you-can-eat shrimp promotion, no matter how many headlines told you it did. Red Lobster died because of a single financial maneuver that happened years earlier. A maneuver that had nothing to do with seafood, nothing to do with restaurants, and everything to do with the buildings the restaurants sat inside. By the time the shrimp showed up, the company was already a corpse. It just didn't know it yet. The story everyone believes is wrong. The official story you were told is simple and stupid. Red Lobster offered unlimited shrimp for $20. Customers ate too much and the company collapsed. People shared it everywhere. Gluttony bankrupted a restaurant chain. It's a fun story. It's also nonsense. A single quarter of the ultimate endless shrimp promotion lost the company around $11 million. That's real money, but it is not company-killing money for a chain that was doing billions in annual sales. Profitable businesses absorb an $11 million marketing miss and move on. They do it constantly. So why couldn't Red Lobster? Why did one bad promotion, something every restaurant chain on earth survives routinely, push this particular company off a cliff? Because Red Lobster was carrying a weight no healthy restaurant chain should ever carry. A weight that was bolted onto it deliberately by the people who bought it in the very first move they made. The shrimp didn't sink the ship. The shrimp was just the last thing loaded onto a ship that had already been taking on water for a decade. Here's what actually happened. Let's anchor this in facts. In 2014, the private equity firm Golden Gate Capital bought Red Lobster from Darden Restaurants for roughly $2.1 billion. That's confirmed. What's also confirmed, and far less discussed, is how they paid for it. Almost immediately, Golden Gate sold off Red Lobster's real estate in a separate deal worth around $1.5 billion to a property company. That single transaction covered the overwhelming majority of the purchase price. Golden Gate effectively bought Red Lobster using Red Lobster's own assets. And the mechanism they used has a name. The deal that changed everything. Here's how restaurant economics normally work, and why this matters. For most of its life, Red Lobster owned the land and buildings its restaurants sat on. This is boring, unglamorous, and incredibly powerful. When you own your real estate, your biggest fixed cost, the roof over your operation, is already paid for. In a bad month, you don't owe rent. In a slow year, the building isn't a bill, it's a cushion. You can borrow against it. You can sell one location to fund another. Real estate is the shock absorber that lets a restaurant chain survive the inevitable bad years, because in this business, there are always bad years. That's the rule. Own your buildings and you own your own survival. Now here's what breaks the rule. It's called a sale-leaseback, and it is the single most important financial concept in this entire story. A sale-leaseback works like this. You own your building. A buyer comes along and says, "Sell me the building and I'll immediately rent it right back to you." You get a giant pile of cash today. In exchange, you no longer own anything, and you now have to pay rent forever on a building you used to own outright. Think about what that means in human terms. Imagine you own your house outright, no mortgage. A stranger offers you a lump of cash to sign it over, and now you're a tenant in your own home, paying rent every month to the person who just bought it, with no way to ever stop. You'd be insane to do it voluntarily. But Golden Gate didn't do it to themselves. They did it to Red Lobster. They sold the company's houses out from under it and pocketed the cash to pay for buying the company in the first place. The buildings were gone. The rent was forever. And Red Lobster never recovered the one thing that had kept it alive for 50 years: ownership of the ground it stood on. Then they started taking it apart. Now watch how deep this goes, because each layer is worse than the last. Layer 1. The rent was permanent and rising. Those leaseback contracts didn't just create rent, they created rent with built-in annual increases. So every single year, regardless of how business was doing, Red Lobster owed more. In a good year, painful. In a bad year, fatal. The company had traded a one-time cash injection it never even got to keep for a permanent, escalating bill it could never escape. Layer 2. The cash didn't go to Red Lobster. This is the part that turns a bad deal into something darker. The roughly $1.5 billion from selling the real estate didn't get reinvested into the restaurants. It functioned as the financing for Golden Gate's acquisition. The asset was stripped out, the value was extracted, and Red Lobster was left holding the lease. The customers eating there had no idea they were now dining inside buildings their beloved chain no longer owned. Buildings it was paying rent on to outside landlords. Layer 3. The new owners kept feeding on it. A Thai seafood supplier, Thai Union, took a stake and eventually became the full owner by 2020. Now you have a seafood supplier that owns the restaurant chain that buys its seafood. Red Lobster wasn't just a restaurant anymore. It was a captive customer for its own owner's product. The company existed to move shrimp, not to be a healthy business. Layer 4. And now the shrimp finally makes sense. When you understand that Red Lobster was being run as a supplier's distribution channel, the ultimate endless shrimp disaster stops looking like a marketing error. Some accounts point directly at the ownership structure, encouraging more shrimp volume to move more product. So the promotion that bankrupted Red Lobster may have been less about getting customers in the door and more about the company being used as a vehicle to sell as much of its owner's seafood as possible. Profit be damned. The irony is total. A chain that survived 50 years by owning its buildings was killed by people who sold its buildings, extracted the cash, loaded it with permanent rent, and then ran it as a shrimp disposal machine. And when it finally collapsed in 2024, the public blamed the customers for eating too much. Red Lobster never really had a chance. Go back to that locked door. The employee standing outside a restaurant that was open yesterday and is gone today. We're trained to look at a failure like that and assume the business did something wrong. Bad food, bad management, greedy customers, changing tastes. But Red Lobster's food didn't change. Its customers didn't vanish. What changed is that ownership of the company was treated as an opportunity to be drained rather than a business to be run. The real estate, the thing that made it durable, was the first thing sold. Because to a private equity buyer, that real estate wasn't a foundation. It was a payday. This is the verdict, and it should reframe everything you just heard. Red Lobster was not a restaurant that failed. It was a restaurant that was deliberately disassembled. Its most valuable, most stabilizing asset extracted on day one, and then operated as a husk until the husk gave out. The bankruptcy in 2024 wasn't the moment Red Lobster died. It was just the moment the rest of us were finally allowed to see the body. The unlimited shrimp didn't kill Red Lobster. A real estate deal did, almost 10 years before the lights went out. The shrimp just got the blame because gluttony makes a better headline than the quiet, legal, devastating math of selling a company's foundation out from underneath it.